Whatever I thought was absolutely relevant and you guys should know, I have included. What I have not included is, made like very deep concepts of models of growth and other concepts which are more relevant to us. Probably we can take a call at the end of the meet whether we need to discuss the growth models for cancer and whether they are relevant for you guys. But what I will be covering in this presentation is this is my outline: cancer cells versus normal cells, a short history of how chemotherapy was discovered, the cellular basis for chemotherapy classification and mechanism of action, and how chemotherapy has impacted the outcome of pediatric solid tumors in the last decade. What I will also be telling you is guidelines for use. Guidelines for use meaning what should you consider before giving or administering chemotherapy to a child? What is your intent? That is, what are the treatment types that are available? The intent basically meaning whether it is you're giving it with curative intent or palliative intent, the routes of administration of chemotherapy, how you assess response, and the commonly used protocols followed by the adverse effects. So what is a neoplasm? It is an abnormal mass of tissue, the growth of which exceeds or is uncoordinated with that of normal tissues and persists in the same excessive manner after the cessation of stimuli which evoke the change. So this is the definition. But if you were to understand in normal terms, is a neoplasm is an abnormal mass of tissue growth which just keeps multiplying uncoordinated in an uncoordinated manner, and it takes no stimulus from the environment that is surrounding us. I will be discussing more in detail about what are the differences between cancer cells and normal cells, because this is important when we're going to be discussing how chemotherapy acts and what makes cancer cells more susceptible to chemotherapy. So as you can see, like cancer cells, a major or important part of or the abnormality that occurs in cancer cells is the loss of contact inhibition. So in normal cells, what happens is if a cell is multiplying and it is reaching a certain point where the tissue can no longer accommodate it, the surrounding cells tend to pressurize or contain the growth of that particular cell division. But this does not happen in cancer cells. So there is loss of contact inhibition in cancer cells. The other thing is there is an increase in growth factor secretion. So normally where you would not expect growth factor secretion, these cells tend to have their own mechanisms of secreting growth factors when it's not required, so that they can potentiate the growth of these cancer cells. Of course, this happens secondary to an oncogene expression. That means there has to be some change at the genetic level, an oncogene which is stimulated, which leads to this abnormal growth. And of course, another mechanism is loss of tumor suppressor genes. So in normal cells, why they do not proliferate or become malignant is because they have certain tumor suppressor genes which keep a check on the growth of these cells. So these are mechanisms which are seen in cancer cells. Whereas in normal cells, you don't see any oncogene expression. The tumor suppressor genes are working well, and there is only intermittent or coordinated growth factor secretion as and when it is required. So what happens during oncogenesis? Like I said, a normal cell undergoes replication, there is normal expression of protein, and growth occurs in a regulated manner. But when there is a stimulus, either in the form of a viral infection, which is a viral oncogene, or a mutagenic or carcinogenic agent, which stimulates a cellular oncogene, there occurs an increase of abnormal expression of proteins, which ultimately leads to cancer growth. So what is chemotherapy? You know what is chemotherapy. Now, of course, the term has expanded to a lot of other things. But if you were to take it in its literal terms, it is the use of drugs for the systemic treatment of neoplasia and infectious disease. This term was actually coined by Paul Ehrlich, and it's basically used both for antibiotics as well as anti-chemotherapeutic drugs, but now more so in the context of chemotherapy. So how was it discovered? It was like most of the things, it was accidental. And what they found out was that during the First World War, that sulfur mustard gas, which is an alkylating agent, it causes marrow and lymphoid hypoplasia. So it was unknown to the rest of the world, and this information was kept secret for a long time. until the Second World War, when around 1946, Gilman and Phillips used nitrogen mustard to induce remission in patients with lymphoma at Yale Cancer Center. Of course, after that, chemotherapy has, sort of grown in leaps and bounds, not just in the agents that we use, but also in the way that we are using these agents to improve outcomes. So what is the mechanism of action of chemotherapeutic drugs? So this is how the normal cell divides. All of you know, it doubles and quadruples, and then exponential growth happens. And for this to happen, a very important component, or what changes a cell goes through, is the cell cycle. So any cell, for that matter, starts like say mitosis, or this is the main step of cellular cell division. And when it undergoes cell division, there can happen two things. It's a cycle. Either this cell which is dividing will differentiate into a permanent cell such as a neuron or a cardiac myocyte, which then performs that specific function. Or what it can do is prepare to divide again. So it goes from the M phase to the G1 phase. Now the G1 is nothing but a gap phase where the cell is getting ready to replicate its DNA. So whatever components, like whatever things or building blocks it needs for the DNA to be synthesized, it sort of gathers all of these in the gap 1 phase. After this, after it has gathered all these building blocks, in the S phase is where the synthesis of DNA happens. After this, it moves on to the G2 phase, which is the second gap phase, and the cell is getting ready for its mitotic phase. So whatever components it needs for the mitotic phase, they are synthesized during the gap 2 phase. Why we need to know this is next I will be discussing what are the agents which act in a specific manner on the cell cycle, the chemotherapeutic agents, and also agents which are not dependent on the phases of the cell cycle for their action. So the first thing that I would like to tell you is the various agents, or the classification of various cytotoxic agents. You should at least know the major classes and what drugs are included in each of these classes. So the alkylating agents that are commonly used include cyclophosphamide, ifosfamide, cisplatin, and these basically have a broad spectrum of action, and busulfan, which is of course used in the transplant setting, as well as melphalan. The antimetabolites, the most famous one of which is methotrexate, 6-mercaptopurine, vinblastine, cytosine arabinoside. Then the mitotic inhibitors, which of course are the vinca alkaloids, vincristine, vindicine, etoposide, and tinoposide. Antibiotics like bleomycin, dactinomycin, doxorubicin, daunorubicin, and others, which are L-asparginase and hydroxyurea. So these major classes, at least a few examples of the alkylating agents, the antimetabolites, the mitotic inhibitors, antibiotics, and others. So now you already saw what were the different phases of the cell cycle. I will tell you which drugs are cell cycle specific and cell cycle non-specific. So what do you understand by cell cycle specific agents? They kill only proliferating cells. That means they act during a specific phase of the cell cycle and they kill only proliferating cells. Whereas cell cycle non-specific drugs, they kill proliferating as well as resting cells. Okay, that's the first difference. I will come to which agents belong to which category, but first let's understand the difference between the two. The second difference is that usually the cell cycle specific agents are used in tumors which have a high growth fraction, like acute lymphoblastic leukemia or acute myeloblastic leukemia, whereas cell cycle non-specific agents, they can be used even in tumors which have a low growth fraction or tumors with a high growth fraction. The last thing, like Dr. Jyoti had mentioned in the class that Dr. Vandana had taken, was that cell cycle specific drugs, they are schedule dependent. More so on the time, duration and timing of when you're administering these drugs is important. And whereas cell cycle non-specific drugs are more dependent on the dose. That means how much dose you're giving is more relevant in cell cycle non-specific drugs. So first we'll see which are the cell cycle non-specific drugs. So like I said, the platinating agents and the alkylating agents, they have a broad spectrum of action. So cisplatin, carboplatin, and ifosfamide, cyclophosphamide, these are drugs which are cell cycle independent or cell cycle non-specific agents, and they can be used even in slow or fast-growing tumors. Whereas those acting on specific phases of chemotherapy, let me start with the mitotic phase. So on the mitotic phase, or the microtubule inhibitors are the Valium alkaloids like vinblastine and vincristine, also etoposide and tinoposide. Then when we are going through the cell cycle, the ones which are acting on the S phase include again 5-fluorouracil, methotrexate, cytarabine, and gemcitabine. And those which act on the G2 phase is bleomycin. Of course, this list is much more extensive, but at least this basic amount of drugs or the number of drugs you should have an idea about, and which are cell cycle specific and which are cell cycle non-specific. So this is a more elaborative step-by-step diagram which shows you where all of these different categories of drugs act. So this is how basically DNA synthesis happens when a cell is replicating. So there is purine synthesis, pyrimidine synthesis, which are required for ribonucleotide formation. Then nucleotides, once they are formed, they get converted to deoxyribonucleotide by certain enzymes. And then finally, DNA is formed, followed by RNA, and then it gets translated into proteins. So if you see like 6-mercaptopurine and 6-thioguanine, these are the drugs which act on purine synthesis. Whereas methotrexate, it basically inhibits formation of both purine synthesis as well as conversion of ribonucleotides to deoxyribonucleotides. Then you have drugs like etoposide, tinoposide, daunorubicin. They basically block topoisomerase function, in the formation of DNA. And then there are others such as cytarabine and fludarabine, which are of course again inhibiting DNA synthesis. And the last one which I wanted to mention, which are important agents, are platinum analogs and alkylating agents, which form adducts with DNA. So this is one diagram which will be useful for you to remember the site of action of various drugs. All right. Is there any doubts? Is it okay? Can I go on? Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay, fine. I'll go on then. So now we understand what the various mechanism of action of these drugs are through the slides that I just spoke about. What we also need to know, and what we commonly practice, is combination chemotherapy. So why do you need to use combination chemotherapy? It's very rare that, in any protocol that we use, that you will be using a single agent as chemotherapy for any patient. What is the rationale for that? So what happens is, usually when you're using a single agent for a very long time, the cell or the cancerous cell develops mechanisms to overcome the effect of that drug, which is called as resistance, right? So you don't want that resistance to develop. That is why you use multiple drugs, hitting it at different points, so that you get the maximum output out of your chemotherapy. So the drugs which are known to be active, what is the rationale for combination chemotherapy? Drugs which are known to be active as single agents, they are selected and they're used in combination, so that they are more likely to induce remission in these patients. The second advantage of using combination chemotherapy is that like I said, you are using drugs with different mechanisms of action, which have additive and synergistic cytotoxic. So it's like hitting the cell hard. You have two drugs which have synergistic action, and they are more likely to kill the tumor cell. The third thing is, like the dose, you should always choose drugs which have different dose-limiting toxicity. Suppose if you chose two drugs to use in combination chemotherapy, both of which cause myelosuppression, then you will end up with a patient who has, severe febrile neutropenia, and you might lose the patient just to the myelosuppression, and the chance that patient won't even have a chance to recover. So you should use drugs which have different toxicities, and so that they can be used in their full or nearly full therapeutic doses. So that is the other point you should remember in combination chemotherapy. That is, you should use drugs with different dose-limiting toxicities. The fourth point would be that they have to be used at the optimal dose and schedule. Again, it depends on your knowledge of the cell cycle. So if you're using at the right time and at correct intervals, you are more likely to get better results with these drugs. And finally, also it would help if we chose drugs with different patterns of resistance, because if you chose drugs which develop resistance to the same pattern, you're more likely to end up with a tumor which is unresponsive to your therapy. So always use drugs in combinations so that they are more likely to be effective. They have additive and synergistic cytotoxic effects on the tumor. They have different dose limiting toxicities, and they should be used at the optimal dose with consistent interval. So, like I said, the aim of combination chemotherapy is to increase the efficacy with different mechanisms of action and different mechanisms of resistance with compatible side effects. So, you have to balance here so that you optimize the efficacy of the drug. Now, before you administer chemotherapy to a patient, it is very important to assess the general condition of the child. Most of the times, even we are very much inclined towards giving chemotherapy to a child, but you have to see that you are not doing more harm than you are going to do benefit. Lots of people might differ when child comes with a life-threatening malignancy, and that is the only option. But then you have to make sure that these things what I'm talking about are ensured before you give chemotherapy to a patient. So the use of chemotherapeutic agents should be used only when the diagnosis of malignancy is established histologically. So many times we get a child who has come with say an abdominal mass, and we don't exactly know, like we've not done the biopsy, and it's a huge mass, and we are not sure whether it will be operable also. So sometimes we get a request saying, can you give a few cycles of chemotherapy, and then we can decide whether to operate. See, we need to know absolutely sure what kind of tumor it is, because the chemotherapy is going to vary according to the type of tumor. It's different protocols, absolutely different diseases. You have to be sure histologically what the tumor is. The second thing is whether the tumor has been known to respond to chemotherapy, either in the neoadjuvant or in the adjuvant form. The third and one of the most important thing is you have to assess the performance status and the nutritional status, especially in very young children. Performance status, whether the child is in a very debilitated state or is in a state where they can actually handle the side effects of chemotherapy that are going to follow. The fourth thing is you need to let the patient recover. Suppose you've given a cycle of chemotherapy, say about 3 weeks back, but you look at the patient and the child's marrow is still not recovered, the child's ANC is still around say 400 or something, general condition is not very good. You can wait till the child recovers and then probably initiate the next cycle of chemotherapy. And the most important thing, which is one of the important pillars, is the use of proper supportive care. For that matter, if I were to say chemotherapy, it's one of the favorite statements of my friend. He said that giving chemotherapy is 20% chemotherapy and 80% supportive care. So, anybody can give chemotherapy. It is anticipating the side effects and giving the appropriate supportive care, which will ensure that your patient will do well. Yes. And also the last thing that you need to know is there is no evidence of clinical disease progression, and how much benefit is going to be there if the child is progressing really fast or is in one of the terminal stages of the disease. So you have to weigh the effect of your treatment versus what benefit the child is going to have. So establish the diagnosis histologically, ensure that chemotherapy is beneficial in that particular form of tumor, assess the performance status and nutritional status of the patient, make sure that the patient has recovered from the previous toxicity of the previous cycle, and use appropriate supportive care. So what are the primary or what are the various treatment types, so as to say, or the the definitions that we tend to arbitrarily follow? So primary chemotherapy is when chemotherapy predominantly when it is used is curative in these tumors, such as tumors like acute lymphoblastic leukemia, acute myeloid leukemia, where all we are using is nowadays only chemotherapeutic agents. What you understand by neoadjuvant chemotherapy in case of solid tumors is what we discussed, say something like a Wilms tumor, a large Wilms tumor where it is inoperable. So you will give neoadjuvant chemotherapy prior to surgery, that is prior to your local modality of therapy, to reduce the size of the tumor. So anything which is used prior to your local control to sort of decrease the size of the tumor and make it more amenable to surgery or other forms of local control would be neoadjuvant chemotherapy. Adjuvant chemotherapy is usually given post local control, like you operated on a patient of Wilms now, and whatever chemotherapy that follows after surgery is adjuvant chemotherapy. Palliative chemotherapy, again, usually in terminal stages or of disease where the intent is not curative, but to improve the quality of life and the symptoms that the patient is experiencing. Multimodality therapy is when you are using two modalities of therapy simultaneously, something like chemoradiation. This chemoradiation, the classical example is when you're using cisplatin in a child with nasopharyngeal carcinoma, and it sort of enhances the effect of the other modality of therapy, that is radiation. So this is what we understand by multimodality therapy. Of course, now all forms of cancer, we use this term very commonly, which is multimodality, and that forms the basis for treatment of most tumors. So these are the terminologies that you should be aware of. So what are your goals of therapy? Before you are going to use chemotherapy, you should understand, because you should be able to counsel the patient as to what you're expecting. Is your intent curative? Are you sure that when you're going to be using chemotherapy in this patient, it is going to be curative in the patient? And what are the chances of that? What is the likelihood that the patient is going to get cured? With the second possibility, where probably your intent is not curative, but only to prolong the life of the patient or to alleviate symptoms or improve the quality of life. So when you're going to be initiating chemotherapy, you should be clear in your head as to what is your intent of administering the chemotherapy to the patient. So in which tumors usually we go ahead with curative intent is, like I said, the commonest hematological malignancies that we see, ALL, AML, lymphomas. With chemotherapy, the likelihood of cure is very high in these tumors. Whereas tumors such as Wilms, Ewing sarcoma, osteosarcoma, along with chemotherapy, some form of local control is absolutely essential if we are to get cure in these children. Now, how has chemotherapy, like why are we discussing this, and how has chemotherapy impacted the progress of pediatric cancer or the outcomes of pediatric cancer? So now you can see the 5-year survival percentage. This is from data from the US, where you can see all tumors from hematological malignancies to solid tumors. It is something probably which people from the past would take great pride in seeing, that almost most of the tumors at least have now got a cure rate beyond 60%. And this has been achieved not primarily because of the drugs that we use for chemotherapy, but also the way that they are used. Protocols, clinical trials have been conducted over the past several decades to ensure that the efficacy of chemotherapy is maximized, the side effects and long-term effects are minimized, and patients have a good quality of life. So this is, like I said, a slide which is, which shows how we have progressed over the last few decades to improve survival in pediatric cancers. So another, just to drive home the point that, the survival has drastically changed. So if you were to see these tumors without adjuvant chemotherapy and with adjuvant chemotherapy, you can see what a glaring difference there is between those tumors who have been treated. Like, so for Ewing sarcoma, the survival would be anywhere between 5 to 10% without adjuvant chemotherapy. But with it, at least in developed countries, it is around 60 to 70%. May not be true for our country, but at least in developed countries, the outcomes have really improved with the advent of adjuvant chemotherapy. So how do we administer chemotherapy? There are various routes of administration of chemotherapy. And the most common one which we use is intravenous, of course, but oral chemotherapy. So can anybody give me any examples of oral chemotherapy that we use? We've discussed them over the past few classes. Anyone? Hello?
Metronomic therapy?
Metronomic therapy.
Yes, absolutely, sir. Oral metronomic therapy that we discussed, drugs like cyclophosphamide, etoposide for neuroblastoma. One very important example of oral chemotherapy would be the 6-MPN methotrexate, which we use as maintenance therapy in children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Intravenous chemotherapy, like I said, majority of the drugs which we're using are intravenous. And Dr. I don't remember the name of the doctor. I think we already discussed this central venous access in the last class. Then comes intraarterial chemotherapy. So intraarterial chemotherapy nowadays predominantly is being used in tumors such as retinoblastoma. So it is a very focal form of chemotherapy where you are targeting the retinal artery and trying to salvage the globe even in advanced diseases. So the chemotherapy is administered directly into the retinal artery through access through the femoral artery. Another example where intraarterial chemotherapy is used is osteosarcoma, though it's not very commonly used, but it was used in the past. Then, of course, there is a subcutaneous route of administration. Drugs like cytosine arabinoside, they are given subcutaneously in some ALL protocols. Then intralesional, like in hepatoblastoma, Dr. Jagdish had discussed, things like TACE, where the drug is directed into the particular lesion. And of course, intracavitary, intrathecal, the classical example is intrathecal methotrexate, which is used, intrathecal cytarabine, which is used in ALL. Of course, topical not very commonly, but these are the common routes of administration that we use. Now, I also wanted you to get a basic idea of what commonly, the protocols that we use at Kidwai. So, for neuroblastoma, what we're using is the ICMR guidelines from neuroblastoma, which has been incorporated from the lower middle income group country guidelines from Methey et al. In Wilms tumor, what we're using is the SIOP protocol. We're not using NWTS as of now. Germ cell tumors is cisplatin, etoposide, and bleomycin. Or in younger children, like who are less than 1 year, we prefer to use carboplatin, etoposide, and bleomycin-based chemotherapy. For retinoblastoma, it is VEC. Okay, I don't know if you guys really need to know this, but it is vincristine, etoposide, and carboplatin. RMS, what we use is the ARST 0331, 0431, 0531. It's basically VAC-based therapy. That is vincristine and actinomycin D and cyclophosphamide-based therapy. And Ewing sarcoma, again, it uses the AEWE. I don't know if you need to know this, but if you are interested in knowing the chemotherapeutic agents, and I can definitely, probably take a class on just the protocols, just a short list of the protocols that are being used for these various tumors. So what are special considerations in children? What we need to understand is maybe, when surgeons who are treating adults or operating, surgical oncologists who are treating in adults, they can sort of, they have a basic knowledge, they can administer chemotherapy, and, maybe the considerations are not as specific as in children. There are 2 or 3 things which make, children unique in terms of when we're administering chemotherapy. The first thing, of course, is the venous access. It's extremely difficult to, gain venous access in these children with such tiny hands, and sometimes, you don't have venous access, they miss chemotherapy. So please ensure that if you are going to practice giving chemotherapy, that venous access is, ensured and discussed with the parents at the beginning of or start of chemotherapy. The second thing is dosing considerations. In children, you have to consider the nutritional status, whether the child will be able to handle the chemotherapy which you're going to be giving. And especially in children less than 1 year, in which the renal function and liver function is still not developed, you need to consider decreasing a dose. So most of the protocols, what they say is that whatever dose you've calculated according to the body surface area, you need to calculate around 2/3 of that dose for children less than 1 year. And of course, because children are going to be survivors, adults, when they're diagnosed, if they're around 40, 50, they have a few years of life left. But children have their whole life ahead of them. Maybe we're talking 30, 40 years, and you've used drugs which have, effects on their growth, on their sexual development. So these are long-term side effects which you also need to consider when you're, going to be giving chemotherapy to any child. After you have administered the chemotherapy, say 4 cycles, like we give in a case of Wilms tumor, what you want to assess is whether your chemotherapy has worked or not. So you want to, like you would have taken a radiological image, say a CT scan or an MRI for a child with a tumor. And after you administered certain fixed number of cycles, like in the case of Wilms tumor, we usually assess after 4 to 6 cycles of chemotherapy. You want to assess the response of the solid tumor. So what is done is, on the radiological imaging, the sum of all the diameters, like in all dimensions, for that particular tumor is taken before administering the chemotherapy and after administering the chemotherapy. And there are criteria for response assessment. One, like I discussed in previous classes, is the RECIST criteria. The other one is available from WHO. So, but the commonly used one is RECIST, RECIST. So it divides, if I were to tell you a broad categorization of response assessment, it would be complete response, very good partial response, minor response, stable disease, and progressive disease. So complete response would be a complete disappearance of all visual disease. Rarely happens. What we do see is a very good partial response, where the tumor volume reduction is, more than 90%, but it's less than 100%. A partial response, maybe, the reduction has happened more than 66%, but it's still less than 90%. And of course, minor partial response would be a greater than 33% reduction in tumor disease. And stable diseases, when the disease is neither progressing nor decreasing in size. And progressive diseases, when actually after giving chemotherapy, the tumor has increased in size. Why you need to know this response to chemotherapy is one, of course, in the case of surgeons, is you want to know whether the tumor has shrunk significantly enough for you to operate. Also, to prognosticate, like when you are giving the chemotherapy, you are operating, you are everything for the patient, you need to prognosticate how the patient has responded to your treatment. Of course, this response criteria for CNS tumors, you can see the details later, but the response criteria for solid tumors is something that you should have an idea about. So what are the common side effects? The common side effects that we see in most children include most commonly nausea, vomiting, hair loss, increased chance of bruising or bleeding, or getting an infection, that is febrile neutropenia. So if you were to look at this figure, what you can see are the common side effects highlighted. So mucositis, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cystitis, sterility, myalgia, neuropathy. Mucositis basically caused by myelosuppressive drugs like daunorubicin or doxorubicin. You have drugs like actinomycin D, which can induce GI mucositis and cause diarrhea. Cyclophosphamide causing cystitis, also causing sterility in higher doses. Drugs like vincristine causing neuropathy. Bleomycin causing pulmonary fibrosis. Again, the daunorubicin, doxorubicin causing cardiotoxicity, and myelosuppression caused by most chemotherapeutic drugs. And so this chemotherapy toxicity, like I said, anybody can give chemotherapy. It's not a very difficult thing to do once you have a hang of it. But managing the side effects, which is important. So I will be spending a little time on this so that you know at least what basic drugs or how you need to manage these basic side effects. So immediate effects which you see, which happen in hours to days, include local tissue necrosis or extravasation. Very commonly seen, especially in children who we use peripheral access, right? For drugs like vincristine or vinblastine, you see the whole subcutaneous tissue, everything is necrosed. So you need to know if such a thing happens, what you should be doing. Nausea, vomiting, anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis usually with L-asparaginase it is seen. Early side effects include mucositis, febrile neutropenia, alopecia. Delayed side effects, something which is seen with drugs such as daunorubicin, doxorubicin, where the toxicity sort of accumulates over a period of time, usually months, and there are cumulative doses for most of these drugs. And long-term side effects, of course, it will be dealt with in a different class where you see sterility or secondary malignancy. So one thing which we must know, anticipate, and know how to treat is febrile neutropenia. Because if you're going to be giving chemotherapy at any center at any given time, you should know about febrile neutropenia and how to manage it. Maybe, sir, probably we can have a short class on what are the broad spectrum, so that when we do get children, or when they do get children, what are the ways that they can handle and what antibiotics they should use can be covered. But this is. Yes, sir. Febrile neutropenia, I think, is something that they should have an idea about how to manage if they are going to be giving chemotherapy in the future. So the chemotherapy, like what you're seeing over here, is the timeline for the febrile neutropenia. So this is a child which you initiated chemotherapy in. So here this is a diagram where you're showing everything is going on fine, the neutrophils are happy, but then suddenly what happens is the chemotherapy starts suppressing the marrow, myelosuppression happens, and then they're on the guard because there are very few of them remaining. So by the time it is the 10th day post-chemotherapy, the myelosuppression is at its maximum, that is at its nadir. And post that, it starts rising when the marrow will normally start to recover. So it is during this time that febrile neutropenia will occur, the patient is more prone to infections, and if you don't support the patient at this point in time, you will lose the patient. Okay, so this is important to remember. So this is what we see usually in these children when they have myelosuppression, where you can have mucositis. This is, of course, not a very severe form. You have children who have their whole mouth filled with ulcers. They cannot take anything orally, not even liquids. Then, of course, this petechiae, which you can see, are consequences of the thrombocytopenia. This is probably a fungal infection, which you can see, a mucor infection, again in a child with febrile neutropenia, which has probably invaded the sinuses. It's an invasive fungal infection. This is like we've seen this multiple number of times in a lot of children, and appropriate institution of antibiotics in these children can help. Of course, pneumonia. So here what you can see is an aspergillus pneumonia, this cavitary lesion which can be seen, again a complication of febrile neutropenia. And the important thing to remember in these children is because they're so neutropenic, they won't be able to mount a response. So when you see the child, say at the 10th or 11th day, the child won't look very sick. And the counts will be extremely low, say 200, 100, but the child doesn't manifest. Once the neutrophils start rising post the 10th day, and there is a lot of infiltration of neutrophils, then is when the child gets symptomatic. They'll start developing respiratory distress, cough. So when the count is extremely low, they might not be able to document, or they might not be able to mount a response also, because the extremely low neutrophil count. This of course shows petechiae. Like I said, these extravasations, they can be really, really bad at times, and we have seen all of these pictures at Kidwai. So it's important to ensure that your venous access is functioning fine before you give the chemotherapy. Flush it with saline. See that there is no leak. Be absolute. If you need to put a new line, and then give the chemotherapy. So this is again a severe case of extravasation where it is sort of gone into the subcutaneous tissue, and you can see the underlying subcutaneous tissue. So what do you do when an extravasation happens? It depends on the kind of agent, but immediate thing to do is stop the infusion. First thing, whatever amount of drug you can aspirate, you remove it. And with anthracyclines, usually we use cold compresses, and with vinca alkaloids. These are the two most important drugs which cause extravasation. So with anthracyclines, like I said, cold compresses. With vinca alkaloids, usually they recommend warm compresses. And with anthracyclines, another drug which is used is an infusion of DMSO, dimethyl sulfonate, which can be used. Whereas with Vilca, you can use hyaluronidase. Of course, if you want, we can discuss the I think we're having a class on supportive care where we can discuss all of these complications a little bit detail. The other most common thing which you will be encountering is emesis. So of course, there are categories of emesis and there are different drugs, but at least the basic knowledge, acute emesis, which usually happens within the first 24 hours of administering chemotherapy and peaks at 5 to 6 hours. And then there is delayed emesis, which happens post 24 hours of giving chemotherapy. Breakthrough CINV, that is breakthrough chemotherapy-induced nausea vomiting, which happens in spite of giving prophylaxis in the subsequent cycles of chemotherapy. And there's also something known as anticipatory emesis, where, even before the chemotherapy is administered, psychologically, the patient has, developed a mechanism where just by looking at the action of initiating chemotherapy, the child tends to vomit. So there are several mechanisms which are, postulated. Maybe the details are not important, but all peripheral, cortical, as well as vestibular mechanisms are implicated in this. And there are recommendations, like the drugs which are commonly used are ondansetron, metoclopramide, dexamethasone. All right. And there are certain drugs which are very highly likely to cause emetogenicity. The common one, which you guys must have probably heard, is cisplatin. Was very bad. The child is vomiting throughout the day. It's very difficult to see. So what are the drugs that you can use in these children? So ondansetron, MSET, plus corticosteroid, plus a neurokinin receptor antagonist. Maybe you guys have not heard about it, something called as aprepitant. It's now used very commonly. So if the child is being given a chemotherapy drug like cisplatin or very high dose of cyclophosphamide, all these three drugs need to be used in that particular child. Whereas then there is a moderate to high risk, only say MSET and corticosteroid will suffice. And low risk, you can just use oral agents, and very low risk, you need not use any preventive agents. The other thing, like we spoke about, was mucositis, and it depends on a lot of factors such as age, oral hygiene, or the dental status of the patient, what kind of malignancy, whether you're giving concomitant radiotherapy. If you're using concomitant radiotherapy, the likelihood of mucositis increases. So in that case, what you need to do is prophylaxis, of course. Maintain a good oral hygiene, because it's the oral mucosa, the commensals in the oral mucosa only which tend to sort of invade and make the mucositis worse. And when you're treating, you need to probably treat the specific cause. If you have a fungal infection, treat it with oral cotrimazole application. Herpes simplex, you can treat it with acyclovir. Switch the mouth with chlorhexidine or betadine mouthwash. Not chlorhexidine. Chlorhexidine is extremely painful. Maybe betadine mouthwash. So these are the things which you can use in a case of mucositis. Chemotherapy toxicity, alopecia, of course, it's a very common side effect, and it's a very good indication that a drug is actually working. But not a lot of our patients are really concerned about it, because they anticipate it and they're okay with it, and most of them get their head shaven. So maybe we don't need to go into the details of that. But pulmonary toxicity, again, like I said, if you're treating germ cell tumors, which commonly most like I have seen surgeons treating where you're using bleomycin based therapy, you need to be sure that the child is not having any pulmonary toxicity or risk factors. So what are the risk factors that you should keep in mind, or who is likely? A child who has received a high dose, total dose of bleomycin, more likely. Child with a younger age who has received oxygen therapy, and simultaneously other pulmonary toxic drugs are given. All of these patients are more likely to develop pulmonary toxicity. And you need to have a high clinical suspicion the patient will develop dyspnea. You may have end inspiratory rails. On the CT scan, you will see evidence of pulmonary fibrosis. And what you need to do is stop that agent. You can't give bleomycin again if a child has developed pulmonary toxicity. One of the last complications which I will be discussing is cardiovascular complications. What we need to understand is drugs like donomycin, doxorubicin, which are used in a lot of solid tumors, they can cause both acute and long-term side effects. Most of the times it's a cumulative dose we're concerned about, but even acute side effects can be caused by these drugs, such as arrhythmias, pericarditis, myocarditis, and hypertension. So anthracyclines are mostly the drugs which are implicated. We have a cumulative dose that we use at Kidwai for doxorubicin. It is around 375 mg per meter square, whereas for daunorubicin, it is about 450 mg per meter square. And what we need to do is constant monitoring, keep these children under follow-up and see whether they have developed any signs of cardiotoxicity. Neurotoxicity, again, especially with vincristine, because you will be using it for RMS and, other tumors. Vincristine, if it is the maximum dose that can be given in any child is 1.5 mg. If you're not cautious about how much you're administering, check 2-3 times, you can end up with a neurotoxicity, such as a foot drop or a, wrist drop. Although it is reversible, but precautions should be taken in these children. And of course, the gastrointestinal complications such as stiflitis, you have handled this a lot of times, part of the febrile neutropenia only, and veno-occlusive diseases like with drugs like busulfan and melphalan. Long-term complications, like I said, will be discussed in later class, but more or less it relates to the neurocognitive function in these children, the endocrine dysfunction and growth impairment, visual impairment, and specifically sterility. So these are things which I think will be dealt in greater detail in the coming class. So with this, I would like to end my presentation. So my take-home message for you is, I know many of you might not be happy to see the first statement, but only give chemotherapy when you don't have your pediatric oncology colleague available and there is no other option. Second, always follow protocols. Like there are set protocols which are available, but individualized as per the patient's clinical status, his nutritional status, his performance status. Third, decide what is your intent before initiating chemotherapy and counsel the patient accordingly. Fourth, anticipate toxicity, both acute and long-term. And if you can, take appropriate measures to prevent, like mucositis or, extravasation. Fourth, supportive care, supportive care, supportive care. It is the pillar on which the outcome of your treatment rests. So if you're not careful about this, you might just lose your patient to the toxicity. So this is all that I had to say. If you have any questions, Dr. Jyoti, if you want to make any comments, please go ahead. I hope I've done justice to whatever was given.
Pooja, you've exceeded our expectations. Don't worry. Your talk was quite informative and quite exhaustive, and I think and it made it very interesting, very simple. This is exactly why I wanted, because our guys trying to read up and tell which they are not familiar may not be able to put it as succinctly as what you did. That's the reason for which I asked you to give a talk here, and even Jyoti for next time about advances in the other types of treatment, because it will be making us easier. It will be making it shorter and crisper. That's why. Jyoti?
Yes, sir. Beautiful presentation. Dr. Pooja has covered probably everything that a starter needs to know. I just wanted to add up 2 or 3 points, sir, because I want to highlight. I want to highlight concepts. A couple of things which I don't know. I will just try, because it may be too much for you, but I guess you need to try to know, because this explains the whys of things. Why exactly we do things the way they are done. Like, for example, to begin with, I would like to bring out the differences between antibiotics and anti-neoplastic agents. Like Dr. Pooja rightly said, both of them are chemotherapeutic agents. Both of them fall under the purview of chemotherapy, both antibiotics and anti-neoplastic agents. Why is it that this is called chemotherapy, and why is chemotherapy always given so much importance as compared to other drugs? The most important difference is that chemotherapeutic agents. Am I audible, sir?
Yes. Yeah, you are audible.
Very much.
Yes.
Very much.
The 2 agents are the only 2 drugs which aim at eliminating the disease. all the other drugs we know that we've learned in our second year of pharmacology only control the disease. But if there are drugs which aim at eliminating the disease, there are only two drugs, that is antineoplastic agents and antibiotics, and that is why they are treated as a different class of drugs altogether and are called chemotherapy. The second point I wanted to make is I had previously mentioned that whenever we give chemotherapy and surgery is done while giving chemotherapy, we tend to give 6 cycles of chemotherapy, and we need to know why 6 cycles of chemotherapy are given. The reason is there is something called log-kill hypothesis. These are called growth curves. All chemotherapy that we give are based on some mathematical functions where people assess how a tumor grows or tumor regresses with respect to time. So these are called growth curve models. I just want to explain about one simple hypothesis which may be very, very important. This is called the log-kill hypothesis. Log-kill hypothesis states that whenever a tumor grows, only a constant fraction keeps growing. For example, we always read this report called Ki-67, and we look at it as the multiplying ability of the tumor. If the Ki-67 is very high, like 99 or more than 90, it means that every cycle, every time a tumor multiplies, 90% of its tumor is actively multiplying, or 99% of the tumor is actively multiplying. Suppose the Ki-67 is low, that means the fraction of multiplying cells is low, like 60 or 50. Basically, if the multiplying fraction is very high, it means it is a rapidly growing tumor. Okay. Therefore, these tumors, when given chemotherapy, also when giving chemotherapy, it regresses at the same speed that it multiplies with. So the point I wanted to bring out is there are definite time points in a tumor size. The tumor begins with one cell, then it becomes 10 to the power of 1, then it becomes 10 to the power of 2, 10 to the power of 3, 10 to the power of 4. So when a tumor is clinically detectable, the size of the tumor is 10 to the power of 9, wherein it measures 1 centimeter cube. When it becomes beyond 10 to the power of 9, that is when the patient comes to us for treatment. So when we give the first cycle, the theory says that a definite fraction of the tumor regresses with 1 cycle of chemotherapy. So assume a tumor is 10 to the power of 10 when I'm starting treatment, and I give 1 cycle of chemotherapy. The tumor drops down, there will be a 3 log kill. So the tumor drops down to 10 to the power of 7 with 1 cycle of chemotherapy. Then I give him a rest period before I start the next cycle of chemotherapy. During the rest period, the 10 to the power of 7 becomes 10 to the power of 8. So essentially, with 1 cycle of chemotherapy, a 10 to the power of 10 becomes 10 to the power of 7 and then reaches 10 to the power of 8 when I'm giving the second cycle of chemotherapy. Similarly, with the second cycle, the 10 to the power of 8 becomes 10 to the power of 6. The third cycle, it becomes 10 to the power of 4. With the fourth cycle, it becomes 10 to the power of 2. And with the fifth cycle, it becomes 10 to the power of 0, which means you still have 1 cell remaining. And to eradicate this single cell, which is capable of multiplication later, I give the 6th cycle. And then we have something that is less than 1 cell. That is 1 out of 100 cells, or 10 to the power of minus 2. That is the purpose of giving 6 cycles of chemotherapy, because I presume that tumor growth is logarithmic and tumor destruction is also logarithmic.
Excellent, excellent. We got the point clear. At least I understood.
Okay. The second thing is about inherent and acquired resistance, sir. This is the last point that I will be telling. Inherent, it is basically the difference between Darwinism and Lamarckism. Darwin said that the fittest survive, whereas Lamarck stated that there will be evolution of characteristics. That what I want to tell in the context of tumor is that Darwinism refers to inherent drug resistance,
okay,
whereas Lamarckism refers to acquired drug resistance.
Okay.
Why am I talking about this? when a tumor is inherently there are both types of resistance in a tumor. So how do I combat inherent drug resistance? How do I combat acquired drug resistance? For inherent drug resistance, a tumor may be, one cell in a tumor may be resistant to one particular drug, but it will be sensitive to another drug. Therefore, I will always have to give combination chemotherapy and not use one drug alone. That is, I have to beat inherent drug resistance using combination chemotherapy. The second thing is, when we give chemotherapy, like in the neoadjuvant setting, I intend to decrease the size of the tumor to make it surgically resectable.
Okay.
After I give 2 cycles or 3 cycles of chemotherapy, depending on which tumor I am dealing with, I expect the tumor to become surgically resectable after those 3 cycles. Because those that are inherently drug resistant should have responded to the other available drugs in the combination chemotherapy.
Okay.
Giving chemotherapy beyond that period is not going to help, because if they have not responded to 3 cycles, they are not going to respond to more number of cycles.
Okay.
For acquired drug resistance, what I need to do is I have to give high dose of chemotherapy to eliminate acquired cells which have acquired drug resistance. Because if I give small doses, the cell will become resistant. It will learn mechanisms to overcome the drug that is given. If I give it at such huge doses that the cell itself is destroyed completely, then the cells are devoid of capability to acquire drug resistance. So that there comes the concept of more is better.
Okay.
So combination chemotherapy is required to overcome inherent drug resistance, and dose intense or high dose chemotherapy is required to overcome acquired drug resistance. So these are the 2 theories I wanted to give importance to. And the last one is something called small is sensitive.
Okay.
Why is upfront surgery always more preferred whenever feasible compared to neoadjuvant chemotherapy? This is where the small is sensitive concept comes into play. When a tumor is very small, I told you that the fraction of dividing cells and therefore the fraction of responding cells will remain same.
Okay.
But as the tumor becomes very, very, very big, the fraction of dividing cells and the fraction of responsive cells becomes smaller. That is, after the tumor reaches 10 to the power of 10 cells, the curve is no longer logarithmic. It tends to plateau. So when surgery is performed upfront, I'm reducing the tumor size to a very small lump.
Okay.
And the tumor is very sensitive. The larger the tumor, more the number of resistant clones, less sensitive to chemotherapy it is. And by giving chemotherapy, I still have a probability of being unable to eliminate all the cells. So upfront surgery is more preferred because a small tumor is more sensitive to chemotherapy and more amenable to complete eradication. So these are the 4 theories I wanted to focus on: log-kill hypothesis, inherent drug resistance, acquired drug resistance, or more is better concept, and the 4th is small is sensitive concept. These are the 4 concepts probably is good to know, sir.
Excellent. And I mean, at least I could understand most of it. And any questions from any of the residents? I think Jyoti has made it very beautiful, clean. Any questions from the residents?
No. No.
Okay.
So just one errata. Actually, last class we had discussed hepatocellular carcinoma. Dr. Jagdish had presented. Is Dr. Jagdish here? Dr. Jagdish? Is he here?
Yes, madam.
He's there.
Yes.
Did you read up triple phase CT? We said we discussed.
Yeah, madam.
Yeah, you were right. You were right. Okay, we discussed the various phases of triple phase CT, the arterial phase, the venous phase, and the delayed phase. And I wanted to know how you will distinguish between, say, a vascular tumor and a malignant lesion like hepatoblastoma or HCC. So what happens in the arterial phase with hepatoblastoma and HCC is there is enhancement. What happens with a hemangioma or a vascular tumor is peripheral puddling. That means the contrast starts accumulating in the peripheral part of the vascular tumor. In the venous phase, what happens for the vascular tumor is this puddling increases. Okay. Then comes the delayed phase. Now, this is where you'll be able to distinguish between the two tumors. In the delayed phase, like you said, in case of HCC or hepatoblastoma, there will be washout of the contrast. Whereas in a case of a vascular tumor such as a hemangioma, their puddling, that is the collection of the contrast, will further increase or accumulate. So you are right. I'm sorry about that mistake. This is the point I wanted to make. All right. Did you get that, Dr. Jagdish?
Yes, madam. Yes, madam.
Yeah. Thank you. That's all. That's all, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pooja. It was really wonderful and very informative. Thank you very much.